My name is Kelly Asche. I'm the senior researcher at the Center for Rural Policy and Development, and I want to talk a little bit about employment and job vacancies in our rural regions. This is something that we've been talking about, I would say, for 7 years now at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Job vacancies and employment in general has really shifted, and I can't stress enough that we are completely in a completely different era in modern history in terms of labor force and employment. There's just nothing to compare it to. So it's really interesting. I know some of you are probably stressed by what you're hearing. And so I want to give you some data to kind of back you guys up and to tell you, like, yeah, what you're feeling, what you're hearing from your employers is real. This is the stuff going on. And this is maybe a different way to approach things as we move forward. So let's take a moment as Minnesotans and let's brag just a little bit, right? So Minnesota typically has the top 5 lowest unemployment rate since the 1970s, 1980s. Top 5 highest labor force participation rate annually. We are almost always a top performing state during recessions dating back to the 1970s at least. And just over the pandemic, with the type of recession we had there, we were actually the #1 performing state in the entire country during the pandemic. And we also have the 5th most diverse economy. I like to include that because you don't have the 5th most diverse economy if you don't have rural Minnesota. The geography and the industry makeup and the way that our state kind of covers so many different industries and types of geology and geography and all these types of things means our economy is super diverse. And that essentially is the foundation at which why we always continue to perform really, really well during kind of tough times in the United States or even global economy. So what may threaten our awesomeness? Lack of people. And this is the #1 issue facing our state's economy probably over the next 10 to 20 years. Our labor force growth has been decreasing for 2 decades. And in fact, in 2020 and 2021 was the first time we actually had a decline in our labor force, an overall decline. We have less people participating in the labor force than we had in the previous 2 years, which is, I don't think has ever happened. Terrible at keeping our youth. And I know we really rip on greater Minnesota and rural regions for having this problem, but it also is a Twin Cities issue. Minnesota as a whole is terrible at keeping our youth. The last thing is immigration policy. Immigration policy has not been friendly in terms of trying to bring more people into our state and into our rural regions to kind of bolster the labor force and provide population for people to work. So I want to talk a little bit about unemployment. We're going to talk about 2 things, actually. We're going to talk about unemployment and we're going to talk about labor force. These are 2 different things. And I have this chart because I feel like there's always this argument. Somebody will be like, oh, our unemployment rate's really low, right? And then somebody will be like, yeah, but all these people dropped out of the labor force. It doesn't count those people. So you know what? We're going to talk about both then, if that's how we got to do this. And so we're going to first talk about unemployment. And that means people that are participating in the labor force but are currently not employed. So let's talk a little bit about that. So this chart is just the unemployment rate for our 7 planning regions throughout Minnesota. And I could do EDR, and I'll show that in just a second, particularly in labor force. But planning region is a little bit simpler to show, and there hasn't been, honestly, a lot of variation across the state. And as you can see, unemployment rates, 7 County Minneapolis is 2.1, Southeast 2%, Southwest 2.2%. These are the lowest percentages in the entire country. Northeast is at its highest with 3%. Again, these are really, really historically low unemployment rates. And you can see what's interesting from the pandemic. We actually had the highest unemployment rate and the lowest unemployment rate in the last 10 years in the course of 1 year. And again, I cannot stress enough how crazy that actually is. There is just really not a lot to go on in modern history on these types of, I don't even want to call them trends, but just kind of comparisons. I provided the state unemployment rate here. This is 2022. Unemployment rates typically are lower in the southern half of Minnesota, a little bit higher in northern Minnesota. This is due to the more seasonal work nature, the more seasonal employment nature that occurs up in northern Minnesota. So it doesn't mean that northern Minnesota has all these people that are just unemployed. It usually means that as you calculate unemployment rates, you're looking at monthly unemployment and you're taking that average. And so you're going to have spikes in unemployment due to the seasonality of how people are hired in northern Minnesota. And so that average is going to be a little bit higher when you look at it throughout the year. Really isn't a good a good term of like saying, okay, you know, who's working, who's not. The counties with the lowest unemployment rate was Rock County at 1.5% at the very, very southwest edge of Minnesota. And the county with the highest unemployment rate is Clearwater with 5.6% for 2022. Now, I wanted to provide an example, and I call this is not our grandparents' economy. This is Cottonwood County in southwest Minnesota. And this is 2022, and I just took the January through like September unemployment rate. And there was a mass layoff that occurred in July or June or July of 2022 in Cottonwood County. You can see that spike there, right? Kind of have this mass layoff up here. A month later, it was back down below 3%. Usually when you have mass layoffs and you have spikes like this, they don't spike. They kind of plateau and gradually come down again. It's very not typical to see a spike like this. What this tells us is a couple things. One is that when there is a mass layoff right now, mostly probably what's happening is one, you have people leaving the labor force due to the layoff, and two, the other remaining being absorbed by other job opportunities in the region. So essentially people are getting laid off and either finding work or they were nearing retirement and said, you know what, we're good. We're taking off. So let's talk about labor force a little bit. So that's this piece. So we're not talking about employment. We're not talking about unemployment. We're talking about folks that are just out of the labor force. I broke this up by EDR, and this looks at what the labor force was in 2019, comparing it to 2021. So this is like pre-pandemic, what was our labor force for each of these EDRs? And then after the pandemic, what was our labor force numbers? And as you can see, if you were to look at, let's say the 7-county metro here, this red bar here, they have 56,000. In 2021, they had 56,000 fewer people participating in the labor force than they did in 2019. That was a 3.2% decrease in the labor force. That's a big number. What's interesting, places like EDR 6W, so Swift County and our friends down in kind of west central or just south of west central Minnesota there in the upper Minnesota Valley, they lost 1,700 people. They have 1,700 people less in the labor force than they did in 2019. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that was 7.2% of their labor force. That's a huge percentage in proportion. That's a big deal. And that is really, really, really challenging for any sort of employment or economic development organization trying to deal with the number of job opportunities. Because again, this is, and I'm going to show another slide, this has nothing to do with job availability. It has nothing to do with it. As you can see too, we have, I forget what EDR this is. Oh, EDR 6E is about 3,500, about 5%. So you can kind of see. Northwest Minnesota, so that's these dark blue charts on the right here. A little bit better, lost some people, but you're seeing right around 3% and 1%. So who dropped out of the labor force? So we've done analysis on this, and we're going to be putting out a brief here in the next, I would say, month or so that talks about this with some charts and analysis. And I'm not going to provide them here because it gets a little too nuanced and just not enough time for it today. But through our analysis, there are two main groups of folks that dropped out of the labor force in rural regions. That's not the same in the 7-county metro or in our more urban areas. This is kind of outside of those areas. It was individuals 55 plus and women. Why are they leaving the labor force? So there are a number of reasons, and we don't have concrete research, but some of the initial research that's coming from other organizations and just kind of, just rational thinking. Here's some of the reasons we think this has had such an impact of these folks in particular leaving the labor force. So one, need for childcare. We feel that this was probably a pretty big reason why a lot of women have left the labor force was the need for childcare. They can't find it. Fear of COVID-19. Obviously, if you're 55 and up, you're nearing retirement, you're nervous, you're scared. It really hit that age cohort hard as a disease, and so fear of COVID was a big thing. Also, I think it's getting a little overlooked. Cultural changes at work. I don't think people fully appreciate the shift that has occurred from being behind a desk at an office to being at home. For younger people, we're used to it. That makes sense. We can adjust quickly. For folks that are 55 and older, this is not an area in which they have a lot of experience. It's challenging, and they don't have the technology, nor the technology expertise to deal with this. And so I think a lot of, we've seen some research come out that said a lot of people are just like, you know what, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. I wish I was in the office. I'm just going to call it quits. And then the last thing that's kind of interesting, there was a report that came out that looked at wage increases, and wage increases have been pretty incredible. It's actually one of the reasons why we're seeing such high inflation is that wages are increasing like crazy, again, due to jobs being available and labor force not being available. And interestingly, for folks that are 55 and older, they didn't typically see the huge wage increases. It did increase a little bit, but not like the 25-year-old that just got hired that's earning $5,000 less than you a year, right? And so I think there's a little bit of animosity and these residual effects of people being like, you know what? I don't need this anymore. I'm stepping away. The last thing I want to talk about regarding this section is job vacancies. And I feel like we've been harping on this for quite a while. I know you folks are seeing this and kind of been harping on it. And I call this from chasing smokestacks to chasing people, right? So 0.4 job seekers per vacancy in 2021. I really just want to see how incredible that is. That's a pretty wild statistic, literally 0.4 job seekers per vacancy in 2021. Now, I think some folks in rural Minnesota, particularly Southwest, Northwest regions, you guys have been dealing with this for a long time. So if we look at job vacancies as a percent of total employment, we call that job vacancy rate. You could see it's been increasing ever since kind of the Great Recession in 2008. 2012 is really when it started to peak. There are a couple things I want to show you. One, this red line is a 7-county metro. And you'll notice that the job vacancy rate in the 7-county metro has actually always been lower than all the planning regions outside of the 7-county metro. And that's due to economic growth and also demographic changes, people leaving the labor force, retiring out faster than the people that can get into it. Now, we did see in 2020, the job vacancy rate did decline, but then it just skyrocketed. Once things opened up, we're talking Northeast Minnesota, nearly 10% job vacancy rate. That's insane. We consider a 3% job vacancy rate to be relatively healthy. 3% would be, hey, you have jobs available, but also those jobs have an applicant pool for employers to choose from. 3% is kind of maybe that sweet spot. 10%'s way out of the normal. We did do some data analysis, and you can go on our website, and we broke it down pretty good. But the data is clear that we feel like employers are stepping up. They've increased their wages significantly. A large number of these job vacancies are full-time. A lot of them are offering health benefits and other benefits. And the idea that, we've heard some folks say, well, if you look at the job requirements for these jobs, they look like they're low scale. And I'm using air quotes here. But that isn't the case, actually. A lot of employers there are no job requirements. We'll train you on the spot. Does your blood pump? Is it red? Cool, we'll hire you and we'll figure this out. And so we heard from a lot of employers that that's what's going on. So a fundamental shift is taking place in economic development across rural Minnesota. From business recruitment, when we used to talk to that in the old 1970s kind of economic development, from business recruitment to people recruitment. And this has become a statewide issue now. It's interesting that we're talking about it a lot more now, specifically now because the 7-county metro is feeling this pressure as well. This is a statewide issue, but rural areas have been feeling this for a lot longer than some of our metropolitan areas. My last slide here is looking at what are the policy implications. And if we have some folks that are listening right now that are maybe county commissioners, local government, or even EDAs, we have to make sure we have the right tool set and the right tools to deal with what we're looking at. So it used to be, how many of us used to talk about, let's build an industrial park at the edge of our town, right? All right, that's not the tool set we want anymore. We're not talking about job recruitment and retention. We're talking about people recruitment and retention. We're talking about housing programs. We're talking about childcare. We're talking about visitor strategies. How are we engaging people that are visiting our areas and maybe we can get them to stay or move? We're talking about healthcare, current resident engagement, investments in natural amenities, and then a focus on quality of life issues. And a lot of this stuff, if you're ever interested, University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality has been doing a lot of work around this as well. And we're kind of, I would say, pioneers in terms of looking into this issue. So I'm going to pause at this section. I did get some few questions here. And I'm going to attempt to answer them. I hope I have answers for some of them. The first question here, are over 55 plus providing childcare for grandkids? I mean, I would think so. And it kind of made me wonder. So I've been thinking about that a lot. And there's a lot of anecdotal stories of actually people moving to a more rural region to be closer to their parents to take care of the kids. We heard that quite a bit. There's no data to show us that information, but I think it's one of the pieces. I think there's a lot of moving pieces in terms of what's going on, and I think that might be one of them. So another question, now that we're out of the pandemic, do you think the former population patterns will return? That's an excellent question, and I actually forgot to bring that up. So we would not call these trends. We call these blips on the trend line. Now, whether they stay, whether they evolve into something else, we just don't know. That's the key question we're going to be looking at, I think, over the next couple of years as we continue to dig into the data. But the only thing I can stress that is that it has happened. And what is us as communities, as counties, and as regions doing to engage these people and to retain them? I think that's probably the biggest piece that you have to figure out and think about. This is an opportunity for you to take advantage of. And how does age influence these patterns? That was another question. And I assume it's the migration patterns. So dating back to the 1970s, maybe even earlier, we have constantly seen in rural Minnesota, or even like I'll say greater Minnesota, so even our kind of more urban areas outside the 7-county metro, typically have seen households between the ages of 30 and 49, particularly between 30 and 40, move out of the metro and into our more rural regions of the state. That is usually kind of the age timeline in which people make that decision. My wife and I did the exact same thing. We were living in St. Paul, but we grew up out in western Minnesota. And by the time we hit 30, we were kind of like, we're good. We had a great time here, but kind of just want something a little bit slower. Kind of wanted to think about family planning and other types of things. We wanted to own a house, but not, have to work a million hours to pay for the house. And all of these things were in consideration of our life. And there's something about turning 30 where you start to ask a lot of these questions, apparently, because it is a pretty significant trend. And actually, you can go to the University of Minnesota Extension, again, that Center for Community Vitality, and they do a lot of research work around resident recruitment and looking at those trends in particular, where, yes, we lose a lot of our 18 to 29-year-olds, but we do see in-migration of these older age cohorts. And what does that mean for us going forward? So it absolutely does have an influence. I think the most recent trends, I think, particularly among millennials, they took a little bit longer to circle back around to our rural regions. But I think the pandemic was just another inflection point to make that happen. And it kind of just pushed a lot of folks that had been thinking about it to make the change. And how does PFML affect this? Oh, paid family medical leave. Boy, that's a good question. I'm a researcher and I like to have data. I don't even know. That's something I'm going to put in log into my little notebook and see if I can dig around a little bit. Feel free, whoever asked that, to follow up with us in a few weeks. I'm going to dig around on that one. That's an interesting question.